Did Columbus set out to find the East by going west because he was running away from 3 women, Nina, Pinta, and Maria? Did rancid meat really cause the Europeans to voyage in search of spice? Or are they looking just simply for slaves? I'm Professor Jerome Markenberg, and I'll answer these and other questions right after this. Hi, Professor Ark here, and I've been teaching a wide variety of history courses at colleges across this country for the past 30 years. In this video, I'm going to tell you all about why the Portuguese began the Voyages of Discovery, why Columbus sailed west to find the East, and how these voyages changed the world's balance of power. At the end, I'll have the wrap-up quote on this video. But first, make sure to click like, share, and subscribe, and that little bell thingy so I can continue to bring you more great videos just like this one. Now, when Columbus sailed west into history and the Gama sailed east around Africa to India, Europe was still a largely rural society, only about 50 million people, where about 75% were serfs, another 10% were free peasants. Yes, there were free peasants. But most of the population, about 90%, lived in villages of around 50 to 300 people. A village with 300 people was considered quite big. And this was all at a fairly low level of subsistence. It would have seemed quite empty and backward to us today. Yet, despite the Great Famine, the Great Bovine Pestilence, and the Black Death of the 14th century, where Europe really kind of dropped off and lost a good chunk of its population, Europe's population, nonetheless, starting the 15th century, began to grow. Grew by 16% and really had doubled since the year 1000. So we begin our story in 1415, when, having thrown out their Muslim conquerors, but convinced they might come back as they had before, the Portuguese went on the offensive, seizing strategic ports down the Moroccan coast. And you see it here, starting with Ceuta and Tangiers and the rest, seizing as many ports as they can, really to deny the Muslims or would-be Muslim conquerors access to the ports and access to Portugal. The Spanish, by the way, after 1492 and their conquest of Granada, started to do the same thing, but along the North African coast. Anyway, the point here really is, in 1444, one of the Portuguese ships sailing down here past south, trying to make sure there are no other Muslim ports along the way, well, they're the first to sail south of Sahara and were able to sail back again. Now, this does sound kind of crazy to us today, but at the time, they didn't really know how to tack into the wind, nor, given the square sails that their ships had, could they really do so. Also, there were strong northerly winds and ocean currents. So ships could sail south along the coast, but sailing north was impossible. You could do it, but you'd have to row your way back. And the ocean-going ships simply were not equipped for oars. At least enough oars to row your way back the entire way. However, a Portuguese sea captain, a different one than the one who was able to sail south and back north, had accidentally discovered that by sailing out into the Atlantic, where he wound up hitting the Azores Islands, which the Portuguese knew about. In fact, they had conquered it by this point. from the Azores that could really make an easy sail back to Portugal. And it's this ability to sail out into the Atlantic, to hit the Azores and then sail back, which made possible the return voyages of Diaz de Gama and Columbus. Now, why are they going south of Morocco and eventually south of the Sahara? Are they looking for slaves? They are not. Are the Portuguese, at least at first, looking for spice? They are not. What they're looking for is gold. In West Africa, gold is reportedly abundant, and it kind of was. And the Portuguese felt if they could get their hands on some of that gold, they could use that to finance their wars against the Muslims, maybe even take over Morocco itself. So in 1448, the Portuguese built a fort at Arguin off the Senegal coast, and we see a picture of it here, from which they exchanged copper, cloth, brass, and guns with the local natives for gold, bringing back about 2 tons annually. But then, in 1453, came a truly cataclysmic event. The Ottoman Turks took Constantinople, putting an end to the Byzantine, aka the Eastern Roman Empire, and cut off European access to the Far East luxury and spice trade. Genoa and Venice were at war with them, and let's punish them. It was really an embargo, and this sent prices skyrocketing. Now, as the price of spices and luxuries rose, the Portuguese began to think of sailing around Africa to bypass the Turkish embargo. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus had related an account of how a team of Carthaginian sailors had done just that about 1,000 years previously. These Carthaginians were hired by the Pharaoh Necho II, and they set out from Egypt, and they sailed south, and then east around on the eastern coast of Africa, and eventually made their way north again. Yes, and I know I had said it's almost impossible to sail north along the West African coast, but so how did they do that? Well, easy. They rowed. Their ships were triremes and biremes, so they rowed their way back home. It did take them 3 years to circumnavigate Africa. Some of the years they had to settle down, grow crops, raise their own crops, then keep going, but they eventually made it. So if the Carthaginians, in other words, the Europeans, knew that you could get around Africa, and it's just a matter of how long it would take. And if you can manage to make your way to the Indies, you could bypass the Turkish embargo probably forever, which would thereby, well, it wouldn't do the Turkish economy any good. So what it is for Portugal is looking for greed and religion intertwined. Now, keep in mind, as I said, did the Europeans go out for spice to cover up the taste of rancid meat? And that's no. Spices have to be brought from India, mostly black pepper, cinnamon from the Isle of Ceylon, nutmeg and cloves from the far East Indies, pretty much off the coast of New Guinea. That is a long way to go. And those spices are extremely expensive, which means if you could afford to buy the spices to cover up rancid meat, you could buy fresh meat. So why are they there? Why do they want these spices? They came into contact with the taste in the Crusades. And Europeans came to love really an explosion of flavor in their mouths. Later, in the Enlightenment, the 19th century, cooks and connoisseurs of dining came to value natural flavors, or only 1 or 2 flavors. But in the Middle Ages, they just loved an explosion of flavor in the mouth, kind of like a curry, all over the place. That's why their demand is so high. Now, the Portuguese kept going slowly further and further south along the West African coast, charting the rivers, charting the ports, trying to make some contact with the natives without being violent or killed or anything. And by the 1460s, they seized several islands off the Cameroon coast, which are known today as Sao Tome and Principe. And then they turned them into sugar plantations. And why sugar? Sugar had made its first appearance in Europe in the late 14th century, become, well, somewhat common in the 15th, which meant that Europeans by this point had become addicted to it. It was, however, quite expensive because you could not grow it in Europe proper. There were some sugar plantations. This is cane sugar. Nobody knows how to make sugar from beets yet, from beet sugar, it's just cane sugar. Cyprus, a bit of Sicily, the islands of Majorca, Minorca. And then the Portuguese were able to plant it and make a profit off of it on the islands of the Azores, Cape Verde, and Madeira. But they needed laborers. This was hard, hot, back-breaking work. And free peasants refused to do it. And the serfs, they actually had some rights. They're not slaves. They refused to go out there. So who will do the labor? Well, they tapped into Africa's slave trade. And the model for getting slaves and then working them in their plantations came to be the model for slavery in the New World. In 1483, the Portuguese came into contact with the centralized and really quite advanced state of Congo. So they're pretty much today's Congo. And in 1491, its king, Nzinga Anakuu, seen here, converted to Catholicism, hoping to gain power and wealth from the Portuguese. But as the demand for slaves heated up, the Portuguese let their slavers run amok, did nothing to stop, even after the king himself complained, especially after the king's son was captured by slavers and sold into slavery. Eventually, Congo collapsed and simply became a protectorate of Portugal. Finally, in 1496, a fleet led by Vasco da Gama landed at Calicut in India in 1496. Now, here is Calicut. And we see here is the Madeiras. There's the Azores, Cape Verde. Arguin is here. These are Sao Tome and Principe, these little islands off the Cameroon coast. Here is Congo. South of it was Angola. Eventually they collapsed as well. And so da Gama and Diaz Rest finally were able to round the Cape of Good Hope, came up. Da Gama was attacked by Muslim ships along the way, but eventually made it to Calicut, eventually Goa too. He was not the nicest man, and when he didn't get his way, he immediately attacked. The ruler of Calicut was a Muslim, and da Gama insisted that the ruler convert to Catholicism. The ruler didn't, and war broke out. It's a horrible thing. Anyway, coming back, Vasco da Gama was able to make it back. He did lose 2 of his 3 ships, but he still brought back enough spice to cover the cost of the entire voyage and still make 1,000% profit. Pretty good. Now, to ensure safe havens for fresh water and supplies. Now, the Portuguese had been doing that. Establishing little areas, Arguin, the Cape Verdes, Brine, Elmina, the Sao Tome, places along the African coast where their ships can put in, get fresh water, get supplies. Here's Congo, Angola, down by Cape of Good Hope. Well, trouble was they had problems with the Muslims' cities on the Swahili Coast. The Muslims did attack them first. They were amazed to see Christian ships in their backyard. So some of them were aligned with the Turks, some were not, but they decided they didn't want their monopoly broken by Christian heathens. So they attacked. And in return, the Portuguese, who kept on sending out bigger and bigger fleets with more and more soldiers, well, they went along and attacked, seized some of these ports along the way. And the ones they couldn't seize, they simply bombarded them and destroyed the entire town. Meanwhile, back in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Queen of Castile and the King of Aragon, married, monarchs of a newly unified Spain, had just thrown the Muslims out of their kingdom of Granada. And like Portugal, they were worried the Muslims were going to come back. Plus, of course, by now, 1492, the Portuguese were making a lot of money from the spice. The Gama hadn't quite made it yet all the way, but the Portuguese were already kind of rolling in dough. So maybe the Spanish can get in on the act. Besides, they needed money to attack the Muslim ports along the North African coast. So they took a flyer on, what the heck, this Italian dude named Chris Colombo, that's his name. So gave him 3 ships, not really great ships, but 3 ships, a crew for them, and enough money to pay the crew and equip the ships. To Chris, who set sail from Seville in 1492, with the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And October 12th of that year, around 10 o'clock in the morning, they had discovered land at 2 a.m., decided to land in the morning. October 12th of that year, 1492, set foot on Salvador Island. Now, on his 4 voyages, Columbus discovered most of the islands in the Caribbean. So you're sailing around. Sailed along the Central and South American coast, at least a bit of it. Established the first European colony on the island of Hispaniola. And if you don't know what that is here. It's right here. That is today divided between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And enslaved hundreds of the native peoples on these islands, the Taino Indians, sending them to labor on the sugar plantations of Madeira and the Canary Islands, and in a generation, only a few hundred were left alive. Columbus famously asserted to the end of his days in 1506 that he had in fact discovered the sea route to China. Of course, he had not. It was left to Amerigo Vespucci, this guy here, who on 2 voyages, he was not the captain of the ship, he was simply an observer who went along for the ride. 2 voyages, 1499 and 1501, sailing here and way down the coast, first established that Columbus had found not the Indies, but a new world. A whole new world. I can't sing anymore. Besides, nobody wants to hear my voice, but I probably wind up breaking copyright. Sorry about that. Anyway, a fairly rapid and complete exploration of the Caribbean followed, led by conquistadores, hidalgos, largely 2nd, 3rd, 4th, younger sons of the nobility who were not going to inherit the title or the estate back in Spain, priests and adventurers. Not all from Spain, but they were all driven by various motives. Some seeking gold, some seeking land, some seeking souls. In other words, converting them to Christianity. And settlement made rapid headway, particularly in Hispaniola and Cuba, at the expense of the natives, of course, who were slaughtered and enslaved, as we see here. Then, in 1519 to 1521, the tiny army of Hernan Cortes, who was born in 1485, about 7 years before Columbus set foot in the New World, and 1415-47, seized control of the Aztec Empire in a bloody conquest aided by native tribes hostile to the Aztecs. And today that would seem a bad bargain because they were eventually enslaved by the Spanish themselves. But at the time, the native tribes saw the Aztecs as the greater threat. Why? Because the Aztecs liked to raid the territory, take their men and boys, primarily, sometimes the women, mostly men and boys, take them to Tenochtitlan, and at the Temple of the Sun, rip their heart out while they're still alive. It's a sacrifice of the sun. As you might imagine, the natives didn't quite like the prospect of being sacrificed in such a way. So when Cortes landed here in Veracruz and made his way inland to Tenochtitlan, he made alliances with various native tribes hostile to the Aztecs, and they joined in and helped him conquer the Aztecs. In South America, something similarly happened with the Inca Empire. This was a recently established empire under Pachacuti, who died in 1471. But improbably, this really young, expanding empire was conquered by Francisco Pizarro, who, with 200 soldiers from 1531 to 1534, was able to conquer the entire place. Now, he did show up really at the tail end of a civil war, and there were some religious things about the white people and stuff. But he did what you should have done. When you have an empire or a realm ruled by a god king at the top, which is what Atahualpa, the last Inca, claimed to be, all power flows from the top downwards. If you could seize hold of the top guy, everyone else will simply sort of live in paralysis. And that's what he did. He was able to get his hands on Atahualpa, and to be free, Atahualpa promised him in a large room filled side to side, top to bottom, with gold, if he would let Atahualpa go. And Pizarro said sure. And Atahualpa did in fact have this room filled with gold. And after Pizarro saw it, he of course realized letting Atahualpa go would have been a great mistake from the Spanish point of view. So he had him killed, and that is the view here of the death of Atahualpa. Conquest and exploration continued rapidly. Quesada subjugated Colombia from 1535-1538. Valdivia conquered Chile from 1540-1554. It's a long country. It'd take a little bit longer. The rest of Mexico was then taken by De Vaca, Alvarado, and Coronado by 1542. Brazil was seized by Portugal, and Venezuela by Germans. Yes, amazingly, the Germans had made their way to Venezuela, led by an adventurer named Ferdinand, who then sold it to Spain in 1546. Another explorer, somewhat famed in the old days in America, Hernán de Soto, explored through Florida. Starting here, and this is the route, his presumed route of march, as far as anyone can figure out. From Florida through Georgia, marching to the sea to South Carolina, up to Tennessee, Kentucky, across down again through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, back to Tennessee, Arkansas, and eventually making his way out. His men ravaging, burning, looting, and raping the natives along his entire route, destroying an entire civilization, the Mississippian Civilization. Not to be outdone by the Spanish conquest, the English, Henry VII of England, who had just concluded the Wars of the Rose, decided, what the heck, let's get our share too. So he hired another Italian, Giovanni Cabot, or John Cabot, And John Cabot went out on his first voyage. Apparently not much happened. Got caught with a storm, came back. Henry sent him out again. Go. And on the way, he found a new land, which he decided to call Newfoundland. Creative and clever, huh? Also, Nova Scotia, which he decided to call after Scotland. And then, in 1498, Henry sent him out with 5 ships. Make a bigger conquest, but none returned, and all were presumed lost at sea. And then the English didn't do anything with it until, really, Sir Walter Raleigh. Or, really, Sir Walter, really? Anyway, the French got into the act as well. Their king, Francois I, sent out the Italian, another Italian, Giovanni de Verrazzano, to find a passage to the Indies. Verrazzano made 3 voyages, but failed to do so every time. He did discover Cape Fear, discovered Chesapeake Bay, sailed into it, the rivers, no, apparently this is not going to get me to China. Sailed into the Delaware, same problem. Discovered the Hudson, oh, same problem. Came back to France and died in 1528. A few years later, another Frenchman, Jacques Cartier, who, by the way, was neither a jeweler nor a watchmaker, well, he discovered the St. Lawrence River, or St. Larry, and was able to explore and sail as far upstream as what is today's Montreal, and claimed the entire area, Canada, for France. Finally, the Dutch got into the act. It's late. Really, almost 100 years after Cortes took Mexico. The Dutch had been fighting a war of independence against Spain, and that's mostly why. But anyway, Henry Hudson, oddly enough, not an Italian this time, but an Englishman, Henry Hudson, did not find a passage to the East Indies or China. He did chart the Hudson River pretty much, really much further up past Albany. No, that ain't going to do it. Okay. Did chart through the Hudson Strait. Oh, this might be it. And into Hudson Bay, which, of course, he named after himself. And then here in James Bay, well, unfortunately, he was set adrift after wintering. His crew had had enough of him. And no one ever saw Hudson or his son, whom he had brought with him, again. Did they die there? Did these future slaves decide we don't like him? Maybe he was taken by aliens. Who knows? But the key thing is, by 1700, the Spanish and Portuguese empires covered the globe, from New Mexico to the River Plate, which is down here, across the Pacific to the Philippines, up and down the coast of China, Southeast Asia, the Indies, India, up to Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz, up and down the East and West African coast. However, Portugal was and is a small agrarian country. It had too few resources and manpower to control their vast empire. That's everything you see here in green, with the little red areas, the ports that they control. That is a vast area to control for a small state. And then, unfortunately, while trying to conquer Morocco, King Sebastian was killed. He left no heir except his uncle, the cardinal, who died after 2 years because he was quite old. And now who will be the next king? The next one in line was King Philip II of Spain, who then really annexed Portugal. But King Phil, his goal in life was to crush and destroy, if not, and probably actually kill every single Protestant in Europe. And he used all the money that Spain got out of the New World to do so. And he began to use all the money that Portugal got from their empire to do the exact same thing. So Portugal's empire was neglected. And slowly, the British, the French, and the Dutch picked off the Portuguese possessions and kept them for themselves. The search for spice thus produced revolutionary world changes. The previous world economic focus had run from the Mediterranean to India, bypassing the Indies. And by the way, cloves and nutmeg and mace all come from right down here. This is a long way away in China. So really, India was the linchpin. So merchants from China and the Indies would come and offload their cargo in India. Other merchants would buy it and then take it up to the Muslim lands where they'd sell it, or anything that's left over, pass on to Europe, because they're going to pay the highest price. And as a result, the European states of the Mediterranean, largely the Italians, prospered. But then suddenly, you didn't have to go through here. You didn't have to go through the Mediterranean and through Arabia to get to India, China, and the Spice Islands. You could go around Africa. Or, as Spain found out, you can go here to Panama, get another ship, and go west all the way directly to China and the Indies, or go around. So the economic focus of Europe shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic states of Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. Here's a wrap-up quote. Christopher Columbus, in 1492, wrote down about the natives that he first encountered, "But they seemed on the whole to me to be a very poor people. They all go completely naked, even the women. All whom I saw were young, not above 30 years of age, well made, with fine shapes and faces, their hair short and coarse like that of a horse's tail, combed toward the forehead, except a small portion which they suffer to hang down behind, and never cut. Some paint themselves black, which makes them appear like those of the Canary Islands, neither black nor white. Others paint themselves white, others red, and others with such colors as they can find. Some paint the face, and some the whole body, others only the eyes, and others only the nose. They have no religion, and I believe that they would very readily become Christians." Of course, Chris decided to enslave them. So, let me know what you think of this quote, whether you think it's true or not, what it means, what it's about, in the comment section below. Also, what you liked about this video, and what other historical topics or subjects you'd like to see in future videos. Be sure to hit like, share, and subscribe, as it will help me bring you more great videos. And then click on that little bell thingy so you'll know when the next History Waits for No One video is posted. If you want to know more, there are recommended studies on this topic in the description below, along with other ways to connect with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the past.